Karen calls 911 on black man fixing his own Wi-Fi. What cops discover shocks everyone. Darius Coleman was a man who valued his privacy. He lived alone in his quiet suburban home in Crestwood, Missouri, maintaining a routine that kept him largely out of sight and out of mind. He worked from home, kept his lawn well trimmed, and rarely engaged with his neighbors beyond polite nods and the occasional greeting. He wasn't unfriendly, but he also wasn't the type to attend block parties or neighborhood gatherings. He simply preferred a peaceful, uninterrupted life. Most of his neighbors respected that and left him alone, which was exactly how he liked it. That peace, however, was shattered one Thursday afternoon over something as seemingly insignificant as his Wi-Fi connection. Darius had just finished a long morning of work and was taking a short break when he noticed something off about his internet. It had been running slower than usual. Videos buffering, music streaming with occasional lag, and calls dropping unexpectedly. At first he assumed it was just his service provider being unreliable, a common enough occurrence that he normally ignored, but something about the sluggish connection felt different this time. Curious, Darius decided to check his router settings. As he scrolled through the list of connected devices, his brow furrowed. There was an unfamiliar device listed under the network. A device he had never seen before. It wasn't just a random series of numbers and letters. It had been deliberately named Crestwood I-1. That struck him as strange. Darius lived alone and his network was secure. The only devices he owned were his laptop, phone, and TV. He was careful about who had access to his Wi-Fi, so seeing an unknown device on his network was a red flag. Annoyed and slightly uneasy, he decided to take action. He removed all unauthorized devices, reset his router, and changed his Wi-Fi password. For better signal strength, he stepped outside to his driveway while typing in the new credentials. The afternoon was quiet, with little movement in the neighborhood. Darius was focused on his phone, inputting a complex new password to ensure no one could reconnect without his permission. What he didn't realize was that his simple, routine action was being closely watched. Across the street, Melanie Foster, a longtime resident of the neighborhood, stood in her kitchen, gazing out the window. She had never trusted Darius, not for any real reason, but because he had always seemed distant, uninterested in engaging with the community. In her mind, people who kept to themselves had something to hide. Seeing Darius standing in his driveway, fingers moving quickly over his phone screen, only confirmed her suspicions. To her it looked like he was doing something suspicious. Hacking, maybe? Why would someone need to be outside, away from his house, typing so intently on his phone? Melanie felt an unease settle in her stomach. She had no proof, no logical reason to be concerned, but her gut told her something wasn't right. Without hesitation, she grabbed her phone and called 911. "Yes, I need to report something suspicious. My neighbor, he's outside doing something with his phone. I don't know what it is, but it looks off. Can you send someone to check it out?" The dispatcher asked for details, but Melanie had little to offer beyond her own assumptions. "I just know he's up to something," she insisted. And so, with nothing more than a feeling, a simple misunderstanding was about to spiral into something far bigger than anyone could have anticipated. Melanie Foster stood by her window, watching Darius with narrowed eyes as he continued typing on his phone. She didn't trust him, never had. He wasn't like the other neighbors. He kept to himself, didn't make small talk, and never joined community gatherings. To her, that was enough reason to be suspicious, and now, seeing him standing outside, staring at his phone with such focus, it only confirmed what she had always believed. He was up to something. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was he hacking into something? Was he trying to access someone's private information? It didn't make sense to her why a man who barely acknowledged his neighbors would suddenly be outside, messing with his phone for so long. The paranoia gnawed at her until she could no longer ignore it. Without a second thought, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Her voice was urgent, filled with conviction, even though she had no concrete evidence. "Yes, I need to report something suspicious. My neighbor is outside doing something with his phone. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't look right. Can you send someone to check it out?" The dispatcher on the other end asked for specifics, but Melanie had none. The more questions they asked, the more she repeated herself. "I just know something isn't right," she insisted. Eventually, the dispatcher relented, promising to send officers to investigate. Melanie hung up, feeling a sense of satisfaction. She had done her part. If something illegal was happening, the police would put a stop to it. Across the street, completely unaware of what was about to unfold, Darius had just finished updating his Wi-Fi password. He exhaled in relief, glad to finally secure his network from any unauthorized users. Just as he was about to head back inside, the distant sound of sirens reached his ears. At first he thought nothing of it. Police cars were a common enough sight in any neighborhood. But as the flashing red and blue lights grew closer, slowing to a stop right in front of his house, his stomach tightened. 2 officers stepped out of the squad car, their postures firm and authoritative. The taller officer, Detective Navarro, had sharp, unreadable features, his hand resting close to his belt. Not on his gun, but close enough to send a message. His partner, Officer Carter, was smaller in frame, but carried herself with a quiet authority that made it clear she wasn't to be underestimated. Darius let out a slow breath. He had done nothing wrong, but he knew how these situations could go south fast. He didn't move as the officers approached. Navarro's gaze was steady as he spoke. "Sir, we received a call about suspicious activity. Mind telling us what you were doing?" Darius frowned, glancing between the 2 officers. "Suspicious activity?" he echoed. He was standing in his own driveway, on his own property. What could possibly be suspicious about that? "I was changing my Wi-Fi password." His voice carried a hint of confusion, but he kept it calm. He had seen enough incidents like this to know that the wrong tone could escalate things. Navarro exchanged a quick glance with Carter before looking back at him. "Do you live here?" The question made Darius almost laugh in disbelief. His car was parked in the driveway. His name was on the mailbox, but he kept his frustration in check. "Yeah," he said, crossing his arms. "I've lived here for 3 years. Before Navarro could respond, another voice cut through the air. "He's lying!" Darius turned and spotted Melanie Foster standing on her porch, arms folded across her chest. She was watching the scene unfold like she was the self-appointed neighborhood security guard. "He's always outside doing something suspicious," she continued, her voice laced with certainty. "Messing with his phone, looking around like he's watching people, and now he's been standing in the same spot for 10 minutes, just tapping away." Darius couldn't believe what he was hearing. Was she serious? He stared at her, then back at the officers. "I was in my router settings," he said flatly, "because someone I don't know has been using my Wi-Fi." Melanie scoffed. "Oh, sure. And I'm supposed to believe that?" Navarro turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, do you have any evidence that Mr. Coleman has done something illegal?" Melanie hesitated. Of course, she didn't. She had nothing but her gut feeling. I don't know," she admitted, faltering for the first time. "I just think you should check." Navarro exhaled, his patience thinning. He turned back to Darius. "Sir, would you mind if we take a quick look at your router settings, just to clear this up?" Darius clenched his jaw. He shouldn't have to prove anything. He had done nothing wrong. But he also knew that refusing would only make things worse. With a resigned sigh, he muttered, "Fine." He unlocked his phone and pulled up the settings, holding it out for them to see. Navarro leaned in, his eyes scanning the list of connected devices. And that was when his expression changed. Because there it was, Crestwood I-1. His posture shifted slightly. This wasn't just some petty neighborhood dispute anymore. Something was off. "Who owns that device?" Navarro asked. Darius shook his head. "Not me." Carter stepped closer, eyebrows raised. "So someone's been using your Wi-Fi without permission?" Darius nodded. "And I don't think they were just stealing internet. Look at the connection logs. It's been running non-stop. Someone's been watching." A silence settled over the group. The weight of Darius's words hung in the air. Melanie, who had been so sure she was in the right, suddenly looked uncomfortable. "Wait, what do you mean, watching?" she asked hesitantly. Darius turned to her, his eyes cold. "I mean someone has been spying, and they might be watching all of us." For the first time, Melanie hesitated. Spying? That was not what she had expected to hear. She had assumed the worst about Darius, had been so sure that he was the one doing something wrong, but now, standing there, she felt an unfamiliar, creeping dread. Navarro straightened up, his voice more serious now. "Let's get inside," he said. I want to see exactly what we're dealing with." Darius didn't argue. His frustration simmered just below the surface as he led them into his house. Melanie hesitated for a brief moment before following, her certainty now replaced with a growing sense of unease. She wasn't sure why, but something told her she needed to hear this, and what she was about to learn would change everything. Darius led the officers into his house, his frustration barely concealed as he placed his phone on the dining table and mirrored his router settings onto his laptop screen. The list of connected devices appeared, and there it was again. Crestwood I-1, still active, still connected. Officer Carter leaned in, scanning the details. "Can you see what kind of device this is?" she asked. Darius clicked through the settings, his fingers moving swiftly. "I can't tell exactly, but—" He paused, his face shifting from irritation to something more serious. His stomach tightened as he stared at the activity logs, his mind processing the disturbing reality unfolding before him. Navarro noticed the change in his demeanor. "What is it?" he asked. Darius swallowed hard, his throat dry. "It's been accessing camera feeds." The room went dead silent. Melanie blinked in confusion. I don't understand. What camera feeds?" Darius exhaled sharply, his voice steady but laced with unease. "Mine." He turned the laptop around, showing the screen to the officers. "Someone's been logging into my home security system, watching my live feeds." Carter's expression tightened. "You're saying someone has been spying on you through your own cameras?" Darius nodded. "That's exactly what I'm saying." But as he scrolled further, his breath caught in his throat, his pulse quickening. "Oh no," he muttered. Navarro leaned in, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean, oh no?" Darius tapped the screen, his face pale. "It's not just my cameras." He gestured toward the list of flagged IP addresses. "Whoever this is, they're not just watching me. They're watching other people in the neighborhood." Melanie took a step back, her face draining of color. No, that can't be right." Darius turned to her, his gaze sharp. "You sure about that?" He clicked on another log entry, and a new video feed appeared on the screen. The footage showed a dimly lit hallway, then a living room, then a bedroom. Melanie let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. "Wait, that's—" Her voice broke. Darius didn't even have to ask, he recognized it immediately. It was her house. She stumbled backward, shaking her head in disbelief. "How? How is this possible?" she whispered. Navarro's voice was sharp. "How the hell is this happening?" Darius gritted his teeth, his mind racing. "If I had to guess, someone in the neighborhood set up a fake network, an access point that looks like a normal Wi-Fi connection. People unknowingly connect to it, and once they do, their devices get compromised." Carter's face darkened. "You mean a man-in-the-middle attack?" Darius nodded grimly. "Exactly." Melanie's voice was barely above a whisper. "So, you're saying someone's been watching me?" "My family?" Darius didn't look away. "That's exactly what I'm saying." She sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "Oh my God." Navarro's jaw tightened. "All right, we need to figure out who's behind this, and fast." But what none of them knew was that the person responsible was a lot closer than they thought. Detective Navarro wasted no time. He pulled out his radio and called in for cybercrime support. "This is bigger than we thought," he muttered to Officer Carter. "If someone's running a surveillance network, they're not just invading privacy. They're committing a felony." Carter nodded, her expression serious. "And if we don't stop them now, who knows how far they've already gone." The Riaz, still seated at his laptop, was already digging deeper. He wasn't a hacker, but he knew enough about network security to trace where the data was being sent. He opened the IP logs and froze. "Wait, this can't be right." Navarro looked up. "What?" Darius turned the laptop so they could see the screen. "The data isn't going to some random server. It's being sent to an address right here in the neighborhood." Melanie's eyes widened. "You mean someone close by is behind this?" Darius nodded. "It's coming from a house just a few doors down." Navarro's expression darkened. "Can you pinpoint exactly which one?" Darius worked fast, cross-referencing connection timestamps with signal strength. Within minutes he had a match. His stomach dropped as he read the address. He recognized it. Melanie did too. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's—" Darius cut her off, his voice cold. "That's Brandon's house. Brandon Foster, Melanie's own nephew, a 22-year-old college student who had moved in with her a few months ago. He was quiet, always on his computer, barely socialized. Now, suddenly, things were making a whole lot of sense." Melanie's face went pale. No, that doesn't make any sense. Brandon isn't... he wouldn't..." Carter stepped in. "We need to talk to him, now." Melanie hesitated. She didn't want to believe it, but deep down, something in her gut told her it was true. "I'll take you to him," she murmured. Darius stood. "I'm coming too." Navarro shot him a sharp look. "No, you stay here. Let us handle this." Darius clenched his jaw. He hated sitting back when he was the one who uncovered everything, but he also knew pushing back wouldn't help. "Fine," he muttered. "But you'd better get the truth out of him." What none of them realized was that the truth was even worse than they imagined. Melanie's hands shook as she led Navarro and Carter down the street toward her house, every step heavier than the last. Brandon, the kid she had taken in, the one she had helped through school, it couldn't be him, and yet, deep down, a voice in her head whispered, "What if it is?" Melanie's hands trembled as she led Detective Navarro and Officer Carter toward her house, each step feeling heavier than the last. Her mind raced, desperately trying to rationalize what they had just discovered. Brandon, her nephew. No, it had to be a mistake. He was just a quiet college student, always in his room, always on his laptop, but that wasn't unusual. He wasn't the type to do something like this. And yet, as they neared the house, a sinking feeling settled in her stomach. The possibility that the truth had been right in front of her all along, that she had misjudged everything, was terrifying. She swallowed hard before pushing open the front door. "Brandon?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady. No answer. Her pulse quickened as she exchanged a nervous glance with Navarro, who was already scanning the room, his instincts kicking in. "We're going up," he said firmly, motioning for Carter to follow. Melanie hesitated but nodded, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to hold herself together. As they ascended the stairs, each step creaked under their weight, the silence in the house becoming deafening. Navarro reached Brandon's bedroom door first. It was shut, no movement inside. He knocked hard. "Brandon, this is the police. We need to talk." Silence. Then the faintest sound of movement. A chair scraping. Hesitant footsteps. Carter's hand hovered over her holster. "Open the door. Now." The knob turned slowly, and the door creaked open, revealing Brandon Foster standing there, his eyes darting between Navarro, Carter, and his aunt. He looked startled, his expression tense, fingers twitching slightly at his sides. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tight, his attempt at feigned energy radiating from him. Navarro studied him for a moment before cutting straight to the point. "We have reason to believe you've been accessing private security cameras in the neighborhood. You want to explain that?" Brandon's face barely flinched, but his fingers curled slightly, as if gripping something invisible. "That's crazy," he scoffed, shaking his head. "I don't know what you're talking about." Carter wasn't buying it. "Mind if we check your laptop?" His jaw tightened. "You don't have a warrant." Navarro stepped closer, his presence imposing. "We can get one, but right now we're giving you a chance to tell us the truth before this gets worse." A long, tense beat followed. Then Brandon exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Look, He hesitated, then mumbled, "I wasn't doing anything illegal, okay? Navarro cut him off. "Then why is your IP address linked to a network breach involving multiple homes?" Brandon froze. Melanie's voice broke as she stepped forward, her face pale. "Brandon, please, tell me you're not involved in this." His eyes darted to her, and for the first time his mask cracked. Regret flickered across his face. He looked down, shoulders slumping. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," he muttered. "It started as a joke." Carter's eyes narrowed. "A joke?" Brandon swallowed. "I wanted to see if I could get into someone's Wi-Fi, just to mess with them." Navarro's voice was sharp. "So you admit you hacked into the network?" Brandon hesitated, then nodded. Melanie's breath caught in her throat. "Oh my God." Brandon kept going, his words tumbling out faster now. "It was supposed to be harmless, but then I saw the security cameras and I got curious. Carter's expression darkened. Curious or obsessed? He didn't answer. Navarro's patience ran out. "How many people have you watched?" Silence. Then his voice dropped. "I don't know." Melanie staggered back as if she had been struck. "Oh my God!" Brandon looked at her, real regret on his face now. "I swear, I wasn't hurting anyone," he said quickly. Navarro didn't let him finish. "Brandon Foster, you're under arrest for unauthorized access of a computer network and unlawful surveillance." Brandon went pale. Wait, no, Carter was already pulling out her cuffs. Melanie turned away, covering her face as tears welled in her eyes. Darius had been right all along, and the worst part, she had called the cops on him when the real danger had been inside her house the whole time. But this wasn't over yet. Brandon didn't resist. He stood there, wrists bound in cuffs, staring at the floor as Navarro read him his rights. It was over. Melanie's breath was shaky, her mind racing through every interaction, every missed sign. How had she not seen it? How had she let her bias blind her? This was her nephew, the boy she had taken in, fed, supported, and he had been violating the privacy of their entire neighborhood. Navarro guided Brandon toward the door, but before stepping out he turned to Darius, who had been watching from the sidewalk, his arms crossed, expression unreadable. The detective hesitated, then nodded. "You were right," he admitted. "If you hadn't caught this, we might have never known." Darius didn't respond right away. He let out a slow breath, looking between Brandon and Melanie. Then, finally, he spoke. "You know what's crazy?" His voice was calm, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. "I was out here minding my business, changing my own Wi-Fi password, and somehow I was the one who got the cops called on me." Melanie flinched. She had no defense. "Because there was none." Her voice was barely above a whisper. I was wrong." She swallowed hard. "I made an assumption and it was completely unfair." Darius let that sit in the air for a moment, then shook his head, turning toward his house. "I don't need an apology," he said over his shoulder. "Just do better." And with that he went inside. Navarro and Carter exchanged a look before leading Brandon to the patrol car. Melanie stayed behind, standing alone in the middle of the street. The truth had been right in front of her all along, but she had been too busy looking at the wrong person. And that mistake? It would haunt her for a long, long time. Melanie stood frozen in her doorway, watching as Navarro and Carter led Brandon toward the patrol car. Her mind was reeling, her thoughts colliding in a frantic mess of disbelief and guilt. Just minutes ago, she had been so sure of herself, convinced that Darius was the threat, the one who needed to be investigated. But now, standing in the wake of the truth, she realized how blind she had been. The real danger had been right under her nose, inside her own house, and she had been too focused on her unfounded suspicions to see it. Every interaction with Brandon flashed through her mind. The hours he spent locked in his room, the way he barely spoke to her, his obsession with his computer. She had chalked it up to normal college behavior, a young man engrossed in his studies or his hobbies. But it wasn't just schoolwork. It wasn't just gaming. He had been spying on her, on their neighbors, on people who had no idea they were being watched. And she had called the cops on the wrong man. Brandon, now in handcuffs, stood stiffly as Carter secured him in the back seat. He wasn't fighting, wasn't arguing. Maybe he knew there was nothing left to say. But as the door shut behind him, he finally turned his head, locking eyes with Melanie through the car window. For the first time, she saw something real in his expression, not just fear or regret, but shame. He knew what he had done, and he knew that she, his own family, couldn't save him from it. The weight of it all crushed her, stealing the breath from her lungs. She had always thought of herself as a good judge of character, someone who could sense when something wasn't right. But when the moment had come, when she had needed to see the truth clearly, she had failed. Navarro closed the patrol car door and turned to Darius, who still stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, watching everything unfold. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a deep disappointment that went beyond Brandon's crimes. It was directed at her. Navarro exhaled, shaking his head. "You were right," he admitted, his tone quieter now, lacking the earlier authority. If you hadn't caught this, we might never have known." Darius didn't react right away. He let the words settle, let them hang between them. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You know what's crazy?" He glanced between Navarro and Melanie, his gaze sharp. "I was out here minding my own business, changing my Wi-Fi password, and somehow I was the one who got the cops called on me." Melanie flinched, because there was no excuse. She had jumped to conclusions, acted on a feeling rather than facts. She had trusted her own bias over the truth, and because of that she had nearly ruined an innocent man's life, while the real criminal had been inside her home. Her voice faltered, throat tightening as shame clawed its way through her. She had never felt this kind of regret before, a regret that came not just from being wrong, but from realizing how much damage her assumptions had caused. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet Darius's eyes. "I was wrong," she whispered. "I made an assumption, and it was completely unfair." The words felt hollow, weak compared to the harm she had done. Darius held her gaze for a long moment, then shook his head, turning toward his house. "I don't need an apology," he said over his shoulder. "Just do better." And with that, he walked away. Melanie watched him go, feeling the full weight of what had happened settle in her chest. She had spent so much time watching him, thinking he was the problem, that she had completely missed the danger lurking inside her own home, and now there was nothing she could do to change what had already happened. The damage was done. Brandon had made his choices, and now he would have to face the consequences. But she had made choices too, choices rooted in fear, in prejudice, in baseless suspicion, and she would have to live with those consequences just as much as he would. As the patrol car pulled away, taking Brandon with it, Melanie remained standing in the middle of the street, alone in the aftermath of her own mistakes. The truth had been right in front of her all along, but she had been too busy looking at the wrong person, and that mistake, it would haunt her for a long, long time. As the patrol car disappeared down the street with Brandon in the back seat, Melanie remained standing there, frozen in place, the reality of the situation sinking in deeper with every passing second. She had spent the last few hours believing she was doing the right thing, convinced that her instincts were protecting her community from a potential threat, but now she realized just how wrong she had been. The real danger had been inside her home all along, and she had failed to see it, not because there weren't signs, but because she had been too busy focusing on the wrong person. Brandon, her own nephew, the young man she had taken in and supported, was now a criminal, arrested for unauthorized access to private networks and illegal surveillance. He wasn't just playing a prank or experimenting with hacking for fun. He had been systematically spying on his own neighbors, invading the privacy of innocent people in a way that could not be excused. He would be charged, processed, and possibly even face jail time. The thought made Melanie's stomach churn. She had watched him grow up, had cared for him, and now she was watching him be taken away in handcuffs. But the worst part, the part that made her chest tighten with guilt, was knowing that she had turned the police on an innocent man while the real culprit had been under her roof. Darius had every right to be furious with her. She had accused him without evidence, had assumed the worst simply because he was different from the other neighbors, because he kept to himself. In her mind, that had made him suspicious. But standing there now, with the full weight of her mistake pressing down on her, she realized something much worse. Her actions could have destroyed him. If Darius hadn't been able to prove his innocence, if he had gotten defensive or reacted in a way that the officers misinterpreted, things could have ended very differently, and it would have been because of her. She had made a judgment based on bias, on nothing more than a gut feeling, and she had nearly ruined someone's life because of it. The shame of that burned hotter than anything else. Navarro and Carter had already turned back toward their patrol car, wrapping up the case now that the suspect had been apprehended, but Melanie remained stuck in place. She thought back to the way she had spoken about Darius earlier, the certainty in her voice when she told the police that he was always up to something, that she just knew he was suspicious, and yet she hadn't known anything at all. She had assumed. And, in assuming, she had nearly cost an innocent man his dignity, his safety, and maybe even his freedom. Darius had every reason to never forgive her. She wanted to say something to him, to apologize, to tell him she hadn't meant for things to spiral like this. But how could she, when she had done exactly what society so often did, judged someone unfairly simply because of how they looked, how they acted, how they existed? She turned toward his house, expecting him to have already gone inside, but he was still standing on his porch, arms crossed, watching her. His face was unreadable, but the weight of his disappointment was unmistakable. Finally, she forced herself to speak, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "I was wrong." The words felt small, insufficient. "I made an assumption, and it was completely unfair." Darius didn't say anything at first, simply holding her gaze for a long moment. Then, finally, he shook his head, turning toward his door. "I don't need an apology," he said over his shoulder. "Just do better." And with that, he disappeared inside. Melanie stood there, alone on the sidewalk, feeling the full weight of her mistake settled deep in her chest. She had always believed she was a good person, someone who could trust her instincts, someone who would never make the kind of mistake that led to innocent people being hurt, but she had. And now, she had to live with that. The neighborhood was safe again, the criminal had been caught, but Melanie? She had never felt more ashamed in her entire life. As Melanie stood there, staring at Darius's closed door, the weight of her actions settled deep into her chest, heavier than anything she had ever felt before. She had always believed she was a good person, someone who could trust her instincts, someone who knew right from wrong, but today had shown her something else. How easy it was to be wrong when you let assumptions cloud your judgment. She had been so certain that Darius was the problem, so convinced that his quiet nature, his preference to keep to himself, was evidence of something sinister. And yet, the truth had been staring her in the face all along. The real danger, the real betrayal, had come from inside her own home. She had spent so much time watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake, when she should have been looking closer at the people she thought she knew best. And now the damage had been done. She had almost ruined a man's life because she let fear and paranoia override facts. She had called the police on someone who had done absolutely nothing wrong, while completely ignoring the person actually violating the law. It wasn't just about Darius. How many other people had she misjudged in her life? How many times had she assumed the worst based on nothing more than a feeling? The realization was painful, but it was necessary. Across the street, the neighborhood felt unchanged, the houses standing just as they always had, the world moving forward as if nothing had happened, but Melanie knew better. Everything had changed, at least for her. She would never look at people the same way again. She understood now that preconceived notions could be dangerous, that jumping to conclusions could have consequences far greater than she had ever imagined. Darius had every right to be angry, every right to hate her for what she had done, but he hadn't asked for an apology. He had asked her to be better, and that was exactly what she intended to do. She couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the damage, but she could make sure she never made this kind of mistake again. And maybe, just maybe, she could help others learn the same lesson. Assumptions ruin lives. Bias blinds us to the truth. If today had taught her anything, it was that people are not always what they seem, and that true understanding only comes when we take the time to see beyond our fears and prejudices. She had misjudged Darius, but she would never make that mistake again. Life has a way of teaching us lessons in the most unexpected moments, often revealing the dangers of assumptions and the importance of humility. For many, especially those who have lived long enough to see the world change, it is easy to believe that experience alone grants wisdom in judging others. Yet, as this story illustrates, preconceived notions can be misleading, and rushing to conclusions can have unintended consequences. The truth is, no matter how much we think we know about people, we never truly understand their reality unless we take the time to listen, observe, and seek facts instead of relying on instinct alone. In today's world, where fear and suspicion are easily fueled by personal biases, it is more important than ever to pause before making judgments, to ask ourselves whether our perceptions are shaped by reality or by long-held beliefs that may no longer serve us. The real danger is not always where we expect it to be, and sometimes the harm we cause is not in what we see, but in what we fail to see. For older generations who have witnessed both progress and prejudice, this lesson is especially profound. It is a reminder that wisdom is not just about what we have learned, but about our ability to unlearn, to grow, and to recognize when we are wrong. It teaches us that acknowledging a mistake is not weakness but strength, and that real integrity comes from being willing to do better when we are confronted with our own errors. More than anything, this story urges us to treat others with fairness and patience, because once trust is broken, once harm is done, it cannot always be undone. The world changes, but our ability to approach others with kindness and an open heart should remain timeless.